Hey, welcome to week 9 of System-Centered Group Therapy for the Group Theory Seminar. This is an exciting and very unique theory compared to some of the others that we covered, with a lot of different frames and approaches that resonate with a lot of the themes that we've talked about in some of the other theories with intersubjectivity and focusing on mindful presence within group work. So just as a reminder, there'll be a couple of sections in this theory that will highlight some overview of the inception of the theory, some differences between this and the interpersonal traditional process groups, which will be pretty apparent, I think. As well, we'll go over some interventions, some traits that are embodied by the group leader, and the core change factors of the theoretical approach. I'll also be trying to highlight and explain this from a more social justice anti-racist frame, to try and infuse that throughout the content to make this a little more, a little less colorblind, I should say. The primary articles used, I believe I used another one actually from Gantt in 2020 that was about ruptures, so I'll list that in the description as well. But the two primary books listed, a System-Centered Training Illustrated Guide and the System-Centered Approach to Inpatient Group Psychotherapy, which has a live text in chapter 2, which is basically like the entire transcript of a group led by Yvonne. And it's really cool to see her at work. And there's always really nice tidbits and things I think you can take from watching other therapists and the way that they speak to and navigate certain things. So not that you can really cherry pick and be true to doing system-centered group therapy, but I do think, in addition to it being its own unique modality with certifications and trainings necessary to be able to actually run these kinds of groups, that there is a lot of benefit in some of the main skills that they teach that can be adapted and used right away in your own groups. So we'll get to that shortly. The sociocultural transference and context. Again, group theories like individual psychotherapy tend to be more Eurocentric, white in their origin, and so as such, most of the theories articles texts tend to be colorblind. They don't really identify people by race or any other real identity factors beyond maybe gender, and so that leaves out a large variable. We think about the influence that our parents and our families have on us. The third parent is that sociocultural context that we live in, right? That feeds us messages all the time throughout life. And so I'm going to hope to highlight and integrate some of those transferences, which is in all communication, the sociocultural transferences and some of the intersectionality, as well as highlighting my own stimulus value as a white, hetero, and neurodivergent ADHD cisgender male, so that when we talk about the theory and interventions, we're using ourselves as a frame of context to the dynamics happening in the subgroups or group as a whole and within the individuals. And again, if I have any missed opportunities for things, please feel free to message me and let me know. I'm happy to continue to grow and learn this process. So the too long didn't watch system-centered theory overview. I'll say briefly that this is based on the theory of living human systems that reflects on the idea that we're built on hierarchical isomorphic systems that send energy to and from one another, meaning that the impact from the greater system above us impacts the smallest system below us. Energy and information data gets transferred through that. Put simply, if something is impacting the group, then that's going to influence the individual, and the individual and the subgroups of people can influence the group as a whole. Now, they place most emphasis on the subgroup level because they think of that as the halfway point between an individual and the group as a whole. Subgroups of 2, 3, 4 members, folks. And so the target for SCT uniquely is focused primarily on the functional subgroups and how they can transfer energy both to the individuals as well as change the group dynamic as a whole. I think it's also something that really speaks to the idea of, again, the systemic oppression and racism, misogyny, other kinds of messages in our society get filtered down and internalized in each of us. Like those strings get attached, whether we are incredibly far removed from it, like in our own contextual life, that those are learned and felt. So the concept of isomorphia, I think, is pretty well respected and understood in group therapy. But I think systems-centered therapy kind of takes it to another level in terms of how they implement it into practice. Suffering, from their view, is caused by each of us taking things, stressors that happened around us, and things that we feel from others just personally. And what that means is you lose all systemic context, influence, and potential purposefulness of the feelings that you have. So there's many stories to kind of highlight that I'll talk about later on. But essentially, again, when we think something is wrong with us, and I would say individualization, which is, again, the thing that this country, and I think the world in a lot of ways, perpetuates, is this individualistic mindset that even for collectivistic cultures, I think it still gets to be a very individualistic proposal that you are the problem, you are what's broken. I mean, in mental health, we talk about mental illness as something is ill and wrong with you, rather than the systemic context of what happened to you that made you need to adapt that way to those roles. And so once you lose that context, once you kind of take away all complexity, you just are left with this binary, I'm the bad one, I'm the abnormal, not normal one, rather than thinking the only normal people are the ones you don't know that aren't speaking to their experiences. So normal and objectivity, again, from our last section, doesn't exist in that way. So I think, again, it can be a really meaningful way that they frame suffering in that, and really helps not, again, to take away the pain or the hurt, that somebody's saying a microaggression or a racist comment is still incredibly painful. And again, this idea that since this is systemic and since everyone is pulled by these strings, that this is the learned adaptation for people to keep their power and to keep things the way that they were. And it's not malicious. It's not, necessarily malicious in that intention. Microaggressions that occur from myself and others within group therapy are pretty pervasive, and something that needs to be addressed while being able to recognize that this is part of our isomorphy, our systemic context. So I think you can speak to that within your groups. There's a way in which you acknowledging that and owning to it and owning the impact that you have can be very meaningful, and kind of help us zoom out for a minute while we stay with the person's pain and repair that rupture. It's a lot about rupture and repairs within SCT as well. So functional subgrouping is actually the core skill and part of the theory that's the most applicable to your own groups, regardless if you're using system-centered group therapy, which, again, you would have to do a lot of certification and trainings to actually get to a point where you could officially do this, since it has its own training experiences and sites. They're very much big into the sense of you don't do the work with others unless you've done the work yourself, which I can really resonate with when you think about group therapy as a whole. But essentially, functional subgrouping is a way to tap into our naturalistic way to co-regulate ourselves with others and shift from those more defensive attachment patterns that we've all adapted to within our lives. So the goal would be for someone, a member, to search their interpersonal, their inner self, their inner knowing and knowledge, and to convey an experience. And maybe something as simple as I'm scared that this group is going to not help me. And to end their sentence with anyone else, and to look through the room to kind of invite the interpersonal connection from someone else in the room. So a second member, whoever decides, will try to attune and resonate clearly with the member who just spoke by repeating the heart of their message. They don't have to paraphrase it exactly, sometimes they do, but they might say something like, I hear you saying that you're really afraid that this is not going to be helpful, and it's scary. And you'll kind of see through the nonverbals or through the verbal communication that that has been resonated with, that does connect with their experience. And once they've done that, acknowledges the resonance, then the second person take a moment to go into their inner self, to reflect on how they feel, what's their inner experience telling them, and what do they want to add to the group as a whole, what do they want to put out there. And it's joining in that similarity while having maybe some slight differences. So they might say, I'm afraid that I'm going to look like an idiot, like being in this group by the end of it. That's really scary to me. And so then that process, again, repeats itself. They add their energy, they say anyone else, the next interpersonal connection happens. And eventually, things happen where there becomes enough difference that the group is asked if they've finished exploring the anxiety. Maybe somebody says, I'd like to talk about my excitement for being here and the excitement of being in this process. And so the group checks in to see if that's okay to transition. And then if the group feels like they've processed that subgroup, whoever's in the anxious subgroup, then we shift to the other subgroup, the excited member subgroup. And then through that, you kind of see that the separated subgroups, the ones that are anxious and the ones that are excited, you start to see differences in the apparently similar, although we all said we were anxious. We're anxious about kind of different things, and similarities in the apparently different. Although I was saying that I'm anxious, I actually do feel also some of the excitement that that other subgroup is now talking about. And that seems, engaging. So by doing that, we kind of discriminate and fuse those subgroups together to add complexity to each of us. And I like this, again, as a modality and as an intervention, because it really breaks this binary separation that I think humans are pushed to do, to separate, to polarize themselves. And there's been offshoots of this. I don't know that they would actually call it functional subgrouping, but I mean, for the extensive purposes of the demonstration groups that I've seen, there's the nonprofit organization Braver Angels that kind of speaks about having red and blue identified people and having them each be in subgroups where they talk within their subgroups. They don't talk to one another. And that's very much how functional subgrouping works. You don't have the subgroups talk to one another. They talk within themselves to really resonate and feel held by one another in that. Then eventually when the other subgroup talks, there becomes a natural place in which the boundaries start to be looser and fuse so that there's more connectedness with people. But the goal is not to say we're the same with one another. The goal is not to say that the red and the blue people are now becoming more purple, but to recognize again the complexity and the dynamicism of how we can be and feel attuned and connected to one another and gain more understanding and compassion for that. So it has a lot of parallels with mindfulness processes in my mind, although it does it in a more cognitive and I think systematic way, which could be really appealing for certain folks. Other concepts that are really important for system-centered, and there are a lot, but I'm just going to go through briefly. The edge of the unknown. They really focus on this idea that anxiety is often the first thing that people feel when they come into a new group setting, shocking, and they really normalize that by saying, is it this fear for what's going to happen, or are you experiencing what is completely normal to experience? And that when we do something brand new for the first time, we have some of that uncertainty we're sitting with at the edge of the unknown. And uncertainty about that is fine. I kind of like to visualize it as a picture for folks. If you're standing at the top of a tower and you're looking down, you see the fear, you see the anxiety, you see everything that can go wrong. And our job in group is to kind of lift your head up to the horizon, to see the curiosity, the wonder, what could be from this travel and this expedition that you're about to go on, instead of the feared catastrophe that isn't actually happening right now. You're just looking down and seeing the fall, not actually falling. So there's a lot of that past future flight boundarying and discrimination to rework people back to the present experience, especially in the early stages of SET, not unlike a modern analytic or other kinds of process groups, but I think very direct and very structured, this entire process. Couldn't get into it all in the summary, but suffice it to say, there isn't the freedom to just like talk as you will. It's all around that functional subgrouping and what kind of comes next to the next functional subgroup. Force field is a concept by Lewin, which is really helpful, just to thinking about the group as having restraining and driving kind of forces. And so the driving forces like curiosity, we need our openness, our curiosity to be able to thrive and to be able to connect with others. And oftentimes that's pushed back by our anxiety or our fear, like, and our excessive amount of certainty, right? So if we're uncertain, then we're open to new experiences and we don't know what's going to happen. We could mess up something and be embarrassed. We could be really happy and connect with someone new we really like in the group or who we feel like admiration for. But none of that is going to happen if we feel certain that I'm going to embarrass myself. Everything's going to go wrong. This group's going to suck. I'm not going to learn anything. So that's like, again, in the mentalization-based perspective, right? Breaking that certainty. And when we talk about noise, they're really direct in terms of addressing noise that occurs in the group. If there's redundancy in people talking, repeating the same kinds of message, or the subgroups even like ruminating around the same like feelings or thoughts, they'll kind of be highlighted that maybe we're ready for a difference and a shift in subgroup. Ambiguity, which is super common in many groups where people are just really vague and broad in terms of how they speak. So being more specific, and I like this in terms of intentionally being specific to your emotional, affectual experiences with things. And then contradictions, like if folks feel like they're contradicting their own beliefs by like predicting different past and future events, or I'm sorry, not so much that part. This is more contradicting yourself in terms of the way that your emotional affect may not match your expression. Like the words are there, but the felt experience is distant and dissonant in that way. Which again, I think could be really difficult or something that should be taken contextually with curiosity, not again as a problematic feature, because that I imagine could be very much an adaptive role for folks, right? To be flat, to look more stoic in terms of how they present themselves as a way of saying emotions are not acceptable. And so I look stoic when I do that. But boundarying and containing people is very important in this, lastly, in that they want to contain people's affect to be manageable. So there's no deep sea diving into like just gushing emotional expressions. That's kind of like going into the identified patient role where it's like, oh good, this person gets to do everything and we just get to eat popcorn and sit back and watch. That's not happening in this group, not really as well like as it would in other groups. And scapegoating, like, and kind of losing that, because you can't really scapegoat one person because always somebody's trying to join in a subgroup. So that's kind of a way that scapegoating and identifying patient roles don't really exist in this theory, which again, there's something to be learned about that to get rid of those kinds of dynamics. So, all right, what's the real story here? As we get into this, again, just to give context, this is taken from, I think, the Inpatient book as one of the first things that they speak about. But Yvonne and Agazarian, the creator of this theory, and one of her colleagues were talking about the system-centered approach. And he throws a piece of hamburger into a pond, and one goldfish faster than the other grabs it. And it's way too big for his mouth. So he's swimming down somewhere safe to be able to eat it by himself. And as he's going down, all these other fish are nibbling at the sides of it and just eating all this, all the meat off of it. And by the time he gets there by himself, there's only a little bit of a piece left that he's able to eat for himself. And what just happened there? Like her colleague says, this poor fish, he went down, like, he moved that entire piece of meat all by himself. Nobody helped him. All they did was had a bunch of freeloaders, like eating off of his food. And, he barely got enough for himself. He says, that's one way to look at it, right? Or you could look at it from the space of this fish, like, had purpose in that, like, he carried this meat. There was no way he was ever going to eat it by himself. And so he became a distributor of the food to an entire colony and sustained an entire colony while still having enough for him to eat by himself by the end. And so that is kind of in shorthand what they mean when they talk about how do we shift from taking things personally, that this suffering, and kind of what I would say it in that mindfulness perspective is like my emotional suffering or pain is purposeless. I did all this work and there's nothing that benefited it. And trying to make meaning and make things purposeful in the context of the systems that you're in or navigating. This can also be, again, trying to interpret things at a subgroup level, an individual, group as a whole, kind of interventions, and something that can be really meaningful just in general with your groups. If somebody is struggling and feeling like their trials and tribulations are purposeless, but there's things that they do that cascaded into other group members being to share and disclose and feeling comforted by their story or feeling like it's a sense of universality and connection, then for you to highlight that, again, even though it's suffering and it's still unpleasant, it still makes meaning out of that, which I think is really wonderful in the long term. So like I said before, SET, based on the theory of living human systems, hierarchy of isomorphic systems, energy organizing, goal-oriented, self-correcting. Systems tend to want to correct themselves and to stay stable. The hierarchy of system, again, is that each system exists in the environment of the system above it and the environment of the system below it. So not to try and take it personally. If we're talking about like counseling center worlds, which I think is pretty relatable to a lot of folks that know me and work in that sector of group therapy, when something happens in, well, let's just talk about, I don't know, COVID, like that seems like topical this year. If we have a mandate from our board of governors to go and, be celebratory that everything's great, and we have this toxic positivity from folks saying, you know what, we're going to go back, everyone's back on campus, everything's normal, August 1st, here we go. And there's that, fakeness in that, and that frustration comes like to our director who has to, bear this news and kind of share the decree from above. Then that frustration and that anxiety and that uncertainty that they're sitting with is going to translate to us. That, again, it's not like just because you say something, it's actually going to translate. So their positivity and happiness, caution to the wind mentality doesn't stop other people from being infected by their own fear and anxiety and influence. Because there is, again, from the news reports, from everything that we see, from the Delta variant now going around and being exacerbated in different spots of the country, a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty. And so that is going to persist and perpetuate all systems, which means we are going to feel uncertain and scared within ourselves as we navigate interpersonal relationships and as we connect with each other throughout the year. And it's going to be very easy to take that personally, right? When I send out an email or something or a message to say like, let's go on a coffee run, and no one responds because nobody wants to go out in a crowd of people or be in a crowded Starbucks, then I'm going to feel like sad or be like, maybe what's wrong with me? This used to work when I did it before. So trying to contextualize things, it's like that mindfulness, again, I would say, as they call it, developing the researcher or observer system. It's just the observing mind in a lot of ways. Is a way for you to discriminate and integrate information, some things that they would say are more objective and then subjective, which again, like you could say everything is subjective to some degree, but again, for SET, when we focus on these things, all work we're doing is in these functional subgroups or members in relationship to the group as a whole. So we're not really working on individual defenses until there are members that find themselves working with and for the group. And that's, again, like trying to, in a sense, I like it because it gets away from this unilateral regulation of the individualism that this country espouses, the world espouses in a lot of ways, in terms of saying like you have to regulate this yourself and no one else will depend on you. One of my groups recently used the metaphor of dishwashing, which I think is another nice mindfulness reference. And they say, when we have all these dishes to wash, which they were using as a metaphor for their emotional experiences, then it feels hopeless. Like there's so many piled up. I don't hate doing them. I hate attending to them. Like I don't ever want to do them. And I feel hopeless at how many I've built up over the years. Then you start to recognize like, you're not the dishes. You're not the technique that like cleans the dishes a certain way that's maybe inefficient or not like helpful. Maybe you're taught by somebody like, you know, when you have a lot of dishes, you toss that shit in the other room. Toss those dishes in the other room where they're not wanted. Just, you know, keep it closed so that you look nice and pretty for the guests when they arrive. Or you better do all the dishes yourself. You better deal with your emotions because nobody else is going to do it for you. And so again, we start to like reenact that by saying, this is the way it is. This is how I just am. So when I say I'm just not a social person, we lose the context like, it's not that I'm just not a social person. We're social people, everyone like in the system is like to that degree, it's evolutionarily baked in. But there may be adaptations or reasons for why it has not been helpful or have not been reinforced to be social because of the context of my life. And so now I'm starting to recognize the adaptivity and what holds me back from getting my needs met. So recognizing that we can have people co-regulate and we can invite others to wash dishes with us, to be able to, you know, use a dishwasher of a group, so to speak, to be able to cleanse ourselves and recognize that, like, you know, people will always, there will always be more dishes and emotions and suffering in life. The goal is not to rid ourselves of dishes to wash, but to, again, like recognize that those aren't all on us to begin with, and it's not on us that we haven't learned to wash them in the like best way or to manage them in that way. And we don't always have to own them. You know, sometimes we can get those dishes back by recognizing their emotions pushed on us and not with us. So all that is to say, I like the metaphor, and I hope it kind of helps explain the idea of personalization a bit better in that sense. So when we're talking about the living human systems, we're speaking about systems that tend to survive, develop, and transform through discriminating and integrating differences. And the core method of functional subgrouping makes it easier for any system to integrate differences. If I had a chart on this, I probably should have a drawing of this, but essentially, again, like it's a circle that overlaps with that circle, and then a bigger circle that overlaps with that circle, and then the large circle. Well, I guess it was in that book. The title of the book gives a good picture of the circle. So when you see that, recognizing again, the subgrouping has both the bottom and the top that they can transfer information to, which is much more powerful than just one person in and of themselves. And if you add too much change to a system, like for me, entering into a new counseling center, trying to change the world just by being there in an energy presence, that doesn't work out, because systems, when they become unstable, when you add new information that they're not ready to integrate, they close and they shut down. And that is normal, that is protective and adaptive in a lot of ways. And again, like, I don't have to take that personally, just because that is the way that people, systems manage anxiety and uncertainty with change, which is very, very helpful, I would say, like as you're navigating different systems and hospitals and counseling centers. So how it's different from psychoanalysis? A lot. It's very different. In actuality, though, like Agazarian did originally learn from the Tavistock approach, and you can kind of see it, like in some sense. She obviously shifted to subgrouping, and I think it's much more personal and has a bit of spunk, I would say, to her. The videos and other things you can find online of her and her work. She's like a very personable kind of individual, but very rigid in terms of like how they do the CT protocol. It's a theory-based therapy. I forgot to mention that, but in that, like, it's theoretically based and bound, and everything is taken from that theory into like, how does this intervention feed back into the theory and validate the theory? So if the theory, if something doesn't work and the theory doesn't, like part of it doesn't work, then they have to rework the theory and then rework all the interventions to fit into that theory. So it sounds like a very daunting and tiresome process that she went through. Again, like, I think there's a benefit to framing things from a theory. They say it's less biased than humans. I would say it's still biased because we choose the theory as humans. But I do get that they're trying to make it more objective and cohesive as a whole. SCT is different from psychodynamic again, because it wants to focus on the impact of other dynamics of various systems that influence childhood in our everyday lives, and again, other than our parents. And so I think this is really helpful if we're talking about systemic oppression and sociocultural messages that we get. There's things that you can like highlight and influence in that to give more context to the identities that people hold and what impact that has on them, what messages they've gotten from the systems above them. I think that's really, again, something that if you don't mention it as a leader, people are not going to assume that you're going to agree with them. So I think we need to give permission for that, much in the same way that we give permission for anger, or we want to invite people to express their emotions as a whole. We need to be able to talk about some of these systemic oppression systems as a whole, or else, like as a white male, people will not just assume that I'm going to be conscious of that, and rightly so. Like, right, they'll go to their adaptive roles, which will probably be to be silent or to just ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist, because that's what a lot of our like coding has been around, that color blindness and moving on. So again, we talked about isomorphia before. Empathy and attunement are key to success within the group members that share their experiences. Really important. It's very easy for people to get in a rush and to push through like just saying their thought. And so stopping them, making sure that they empathize and attune to the person's first response, and make sure they make contact in some way meaningfully before they move on to their thought. And they're already anxious and worked up. And so again, it's understandable, but I think that's really like what they do to rein that in and be very structured with it. The reflections also tend to shift from checking in on where these current roles or emotions are coming from. Are these past emotional experiences? Are they about the present context, if we reflect on that? And they also talk about it paralleling polyvagal theory, Borges' polyvagal theory. And I really love this, actually. I use this all the time with folks, like in terms of like my little pen. So saying like, again, polyvagal theory would say that there's 3 parts of our spine. If this is the spine, the vagus nerve, and the top part being the ventrovagal, which is essentially when we have that activated, we're open, we're curious, we're engaged and willing to connect with others. That's kind of our life energy in a lot of ways. When we're in the parasympathetic system, that middle stomach to chest system, that's our fight, flight, and that's energy, like too, the anxiety, the fear, the anger, like that can be very transformative in terms of how it frames things for people. And then lastly, the dorsal vagal, this bottom part, which is like our beneath our stomach, our waist down to the end, that is our freeze response. That is the shut down and turn off the emotional valve and turn off the physical pain. I'm going to be mauled by a bear and I don't want to feel the pain anymore because I'm about to die. So numb everything. And people talk about that all the time, feeling numb, feeling empty. And so when I think you frame it like that, again, it's kind of like, well, if you're numb, if you're indifferent, if you're like, zoning out, then that is protective. And that is most likely something that you're running away from, or would feel so intense with the fight and flight that instead of staying in that, you're avoiding it, like being aversive to it by closing down and honoring that and saying like, that's okay. Like, right, but that's part of what we're wanting to do, is to help people recognize that defense and to lean into what it would be like to explore rather than explain. And so we'll go into some of the other things that like go alongside that. But that's in short how it looks different from psychoanalytic process groups. There's a lot though we could get to in this. Let's see. So functional subgrouping in a nutshell, I kind of mentioned this before, but it's the core method of system-centered therapy. Conflicts will emerge in all groups. And again, that mostly separates around people wanting to get rid of differences than they see in others. And I think when it comes to power and others, like we fear like what we don't recognize when we don't recognize ourselves in something. Like we don't shoot strangers, right? Like, or we can only shoot strangers. Like when we start to see ourselves and personalize and recognize that like a part of me is in the other person, and that we are connected in a lot of ways that may not be readily apparent, then that makes it much easier to be able to empathize and connect with one another. So oftentimes with differentiating ourselves from others, we want to split ourselves off, make somebody the scapegoat who's doing the bad stuff, make somebody the identified patient who's the sick one that needs to be cured, not me. And the subfunctional subgrouping, again, can help with that. Tolerable differences emerge in the subgroups eventually, and then at some point the boundaries of the subgroups become more diffuse and members can kind of cross subgroups. And it's functional in that, again, like people aren't like set in roles to one specific subgroups. It's not really helpful, or I don't think like intended to be like something that you subgroup around certain identity factors either. So doing something like, by gender or by race, ethnicity is not so much like what we're wanting to reinforce is that splitting an experience. Now, if somebody has a felt experience and people of different similar identity factors join them in that, then I think that is okay, right? That's the felt like subjective truth experience that they're wanting to resonate around. And something that I think can be problematic in this is, again, because one subgroup within the subgroup does the work and no other subgroup is allowed to interject until the group as a whole kind of decides that they are done and that they have explored this purposefully enough, then that can lead to a lot of concern and effects on that. Because maybe one subgroup starts with something that feels a bit discriminatory or hurtful, and other people want to speak dissently and dissent it, but they're not given the space or energy. And so it feels like we've kind of monopolized maybe a white supremacist like voice or attitude, or like, even like white fragility around like maybe a subgroup of white folks being worried that they're going to say something stupid and be seen as a racist. And so that, like, again, all that fear and that flight can make people really frustrated at that, fragility, as they haven't had to deal with the stress that many other people of color have had, racial stress throughout their lives in different ways. So I don't know, like this might be hearsay, like heresy for SCT, but things like that, again, I think context matters, right? Because what are we recreating if we don't allow that other subgroup to speak, if we have to finish with this subgroup before we move on? So in terms of flexibility of the theory, again, I feel as if you don't want to recapitulate the dynamic of let the white people talk and let them get all their things out while like you people of color just wait your turn. Like this might be something where the leader has to make a choice to say like I'm noticing a split in difference, and let's, park this subgroup to the side. This feels like meaningful energy. And it sounds like we really need to attend to this subgroup and work through this energy first, and then we'll go back. Because I think the way that the subgroups start is usually just whoever says something first. And that seems like a very scary thing to not have any control over. If somebody starts with a certain topic or way, and then another group is unable to be attended to because that subgroup has so much initial energy that they will not want to get off. Other theories also talk about, again, like parking things to the side and ensuring that you return to them. So it makes me curious if there could be some flexibility within that frame as well with that, because that context really does matter and have an impact on people if it's not addressed. So the functional subgrouping, what it looks like in short, it's not super short, but SCT often begins with a brief grounding exercise for members to feel centered in their present experience, and some mindfulness practice really. Identify a distinct subgroup, people excited about the group versus people afraid of the group. It's just an example that tends to come up. Start with a subgroup who has the most energy, asking members to explore their thoughts, emotions surrounding their subgroup experience, holding off on the other subgroup, speaking momentarily. But again, most of the time it just starts with one person saying, I'm anxious, and then that's the subgroup that starts to speak. Even though maybe both are offered, but you may not know the second or third subgroup that emerges until some energy or frustration gets brought up, like for people, or hurt, or sadness for what's happening and unfolding within the group process. So people are not asked to speak or to cross subgroups, like just to stay within their similar views. And again, that is meant purposely to be protective of scapegoating and misunderstanding, more to like let the group like notice their differences, even though they all say they're in the same subgroup and they're the exact same. And goes through that experience, like I mentioned before. The first member speaks. What's their inner truth? Says anyone else to indicate that they've finished. Inviting a second member to speak back and resonate with the felt experience of the first member. Acknowledging their presence, making eye contact with them. And the first member may nod, acknowledge that they felt heard or understood, leading the second member to ground themselves again, speak whatever their current experiences are, their thoughts, their feelings, offer that to the group, and then that repeats as the subgroup forms. And then they explore their shared experiences, stopping once they're ready to integrate a different perspective. So that's ostensibly what it looks like. And again, I think this is something you can really use to great advantage within process groups. Because there's oftentimes like a subgroup of people that are forming, and even if you have one subgroup that's active and one that's silent, that can be a really meaningful differentiation as well. So how this shifts from a regular group thinking, again, they're very structured at the beginning. There's highly structured rules that systematically kind of break some of the norms defensive. It can be reframed kind of as a game, which causes some resistance from members. But the goal from it is to go from that pathologizing to depathologizing and humanizing stance. And I think there is something about being able to integrate those differences that can be really meaningful. Silent members are not encouraged to like participate or be, like people will be respected for their silence. Like they're not going to be forced to speak necessarily. Which may be different from other groups that see that as toxic to the group dynamic. It's more of an acceptance of, I think, where people are in that process and acknowledging that. The humor, there's humor and lightheartedness in terms of like the playfulness of what the leader can act like and kind of invite the group to do. And some education kind of interspersed throughout to highlight some of the concepts or the ways in which they maybe reframe emotional experiences. Functional subgrouping is obviously the cornerstone, like we talked about, and it's really meant for that right brain to right brain co-regulation to restore empathic attunement to others, which is seen as our birthright. It's our right, and again, I like that as a way of saying we're meant to and deserve to be able to attune to others empathically and to be cared for in that way. So the hierarchy of the 3 system level of intervention is there's a person system with its goal of survival. There's the member or interperson system, which is the goal of development, like in the subgroups, and the group system as a whole with the goals of setting and revising norms that maintain connection to the person system goal, as well as the larger context around them. So at the member level, members work in functional subgroups wherever differences are not easily integrated. And again, I think in terms of like the counseling center that I work at, there's obviously like the whole group, the whole counseling center is working within a university system and has its connection to that, as well as the goals of the larger context of that. And so that may differ greatly from what our interperson or person-centered goals are. And understandably so, we might be worried about our survival with things and also want to develop things within our community that may go against that. So trying to make differences within the subgroups would be the best way to change that, to enact change in systems, according to SCT. Techniques within SCT, they're integrated from the very beginning, again, like in a step-by-step method to, there's also a hierarchy in terms of like how they address things from like simplest and easiest to more complex and difficult. And there's entire trainings for this. So this was a peek at some of the complexity I'm sure that they have. But the first actual intervention they speak to is, again, the functional subgrouping, the tendency of humans to split away from unacceptable differences as a fear-based response, and allow members to recognize and integrate those differences, the human aversion to differences that becomes overt or covert scapegoating. And that's kind of like what they work to eliminate. The second is the use of boundary, which is to limit the defensive use of language and manage closeness and the distance between people rather than exchanging information that's related to the work that the group has to do together. The yes, but, like, kind of experience where it's like, yeah, it's kind of like that, but it's actually this. It's not really meant to join. Leading questions, narrow questions, personal questions, fact-finding questions, just questions in general. Like, they really control the information that's introduced, and they take it away from the person that's asking the question and back on the person who is asking. There's no joining with questions. And also, like, I mentioned in a later slide, I think that this idea of feeling specificity in terms of when people say, I feel like nobody really gets me in this group. That's not a feeling. That's something that they're maybe imagining as a feeling, but it's a thought. And so when you focus in, like, boundarying and redirecting people's language like that, I think you can really set that norm at the beginning, that there's just unique ways that we've all learned to socialize and communicate, and we're going to note those things and be curious about how we can add more specificity to it. Really good to say these things up front, though, because if you're interjecting this much and correcting people, it can feel very easy to fall into that, critical, like, hopeless feeling that I'm just messing this up and it's not working. So wanting to normalize that early is important. Some other interventions, like the fork in the road. This connects the group and its members to their goals. Ambivalence is reframed as a defense against conflict, which disappears when conflict is identified. And again, like, that's that ambivalence of like, I don't know, could be either. Like, if I tell somebody, like, that's, I want to know who they're feeling most connected to, then again, that fork in the road of, like, who am I going to choose here is always scary, and they'll always want to be ambivalent and say, everyone's great. You wouldn't actually do that necessarily in this. This is more about noticing when someone is sitting on the fence between their experiences. And oftentimes they frame that as a difference between exploring and explaining, which we'll kind of talk about in more detail soon. But essentially the exploring aspect is when we have energy, like we explore things, that idea of, like, you're on the edge of the unknown, you explore the horizon, and you can explore what experience you're having, what conflicts, what emotions, impulses you're having right now in this moment that are typically defended against. But if you're explaining, like, somebody says, are you feeling anxious right now? And you say, well, it's not really anxiety. What happens to me is when I do this, new kind of thing, I start thinking about my dad and all the things that made me anxious when he was judging me. And that, like, again, is things that you're explaining why you're this way, which is all information that you already know. There's nothing to be learned there because you're explaining something that feels safe and certain to you. So rather than the uncertainty of the present moment, you go to the certainty of the past. You defend or avert against any curiosity of what could be, and you have, like, a definitive kind of answer. You also don't speak necessarily about your emotions. You don't lean into conflicts or do any kind of, like, reality testing with that. There's a really nice model for this that they use, Lewin's force field model. And again, that says, like, we all have these dynamic forces that are, like, both driving forces and restraining forces to stay the same. And this is something that I think, if you're thinking about yourself navigating the system like a counseling center or just within the group therapy model, it can be really helpful just in terms of human dynamics to think of that. Are we exploring experiences? Are we defending against experiences that are shared? Are we exploring what could be before explaining what is? Or are we explaining that? Are we wanting to accept that we are in uncertainty right now as we go into a fall semester where we don't know how people are going to react to being back in person or how safe things actually are? Or are we going to be certain that this is what's going to happen, this is what we're going to do, and kind of, live in that denial of the uncertainty that's ahead? Are we going to test reality, or are we going to, like, if we mind read somebody else, if we have a negative prediction about the future, or are we going to take reality for granted that, nope, this is my felt experience, that's obviously the true experience, like objectively the true experience. So again, that idea of, like, are we being curious or are we not? Like that's where it comes down to. And really, they can kind of frame the restraining forces as these symptoms or disorders in mental health. That would be, it's not actually like acknowledged in SCT theory, but it's kind of how you could frame it in some ways. And this, the goal of that in SCT is usually to reduce the restraining forces so that the natural energy from the driving forces can push through. So being open and curious about that, I think, can be really helpful as a way to frame it. So reframing emotional experiences, I think SCT does a lot of really good when it comes to ways of reframing language and speaking to experiences of emotions to normalize and depathologize our human experiences. So again, anxiety of not knowing, like reframed as normal apprehension at the edge of the unknown, which like just feels very, I don't know, more ephemeral and kind of comforting as an image for me than you know, a fear of that. Shyness and embarrassment is reframed as turbulence of the boundary. Like if we're feeling like shy or embarrassed or ashamed, then there's a true part of us that wants to show. Maybe I want to show somebody and say like that I'm attracted to them, but I'm really shy, I'm really embarrassed. And partially, like that's because if I say that, I'm fearful of like, what do they want, or maybe what does the group want me to like be like? They maybe don't want me to express myself, or they don't want to like know that. And so I'm sitting with this like, here's my true authentic self where I want to express like a part of me, but because I feel this like judgment and this shyness and embarrassment basically tells me that there's a conflict in that boundary role that I'm setting, which I think is an interesting way, again, of framing it, that there's a purposefulness to it and something that like a feared catastrophe that we can like recognize is occurring between like what we think the group wants of us and what we want to be able to express. Keeping people in a box, it's a phrase that they use in here, which I think is an interesting way of, again, challenging some of that vagueness, the maybe, I guess, I think so. And really getting them down to like a yes or no, like, and like staying with them so that they kind of say that definitively. So, because you want to have a secure sense of yourself and your known felt experience. So I think it does really get at that, like your truth, your subjective felt truth is your truth. Like, so I'm not convincing you that this is necessarily, but I want to stay with you and not make you feel like you have to guess. And sometimes, again, if they say like, well, I can't know, I have to see what happens, then you need to see what happens. Like, okay, so that's where we're at in that. Is that like, at least again, you're waiting and you check in with them later to see if they've recognized, is it a yes or a no now? Are we still waiting to see if something has happened for you right now? Also, again, when we keep people in a box and contained in that way, we get away from this deep sea diving, this metaphor that they use for emotional flooding, which in the polyvagal theory sense, again, it's very cathartic. It's a flood of emotional affect, but it doesn't really help in terms of how can that person have their feelings and not flood everywhere? How can they own their experiences and their felt truth without feeling like that means they have to fall apart, you know, or that the only way that they can manage it is to flood. So it kind of tries to contain that while being able to own and stay with that like experience for people. Pat DeMar is a big influence on this, and I really find this just like such a great concept. And again, he says it in very poetic and I think better ways. But essentially, anger is often conflated with hatred in society, and I think that's so true in our polarized sociopolitical landscape. And it can be seen, I mean, in any interpersonal interactions too. You can take anger as hatred, or you can actually see it as something that's maybe more intimate of an expression and something that conveys some significant emotional information. I think I may have mentioned last week that, again, anger, if we imagine it's a secondary experience, like you can't be, and there's no reason to be angry at someone if there's not some felt pain, suffering, shame, sadness, embarrassment underneath. And so sometimes that emotional experience is so painful, for me, maybe selfishness, that I don't want to feel selfishness. And so rather than owning that vulnerability, I'll be angry and lash out at my partner or someone to make them feel selfish for me, because it's really hard for me to like sit with. And so if we take the anger personally as Vinny hates me, then like we get stuck in that. But if we take that as I'm feeling like selfish, or I'm recognizing that Vinny like may also be feeling selfish because I don't feel selfish that often, then you can see me as kind of holding up this wound. And even with microaggressions, right? When somebody says they're being hurt and they've been impacted by you, they're holding up something very tender, and it's important for us to be able to acknowledge the intimacy of that expression, rather than jump to the defensiveness of, oh my God, I can't be hated as a white person. I can't be like seen as a bad one or a racist. I have to be seen in a great light. And so I think that again speaks to how you can reframe anger in that like social cultural context that we typically take it as. Simple feeling words are direct translations of emotions. They just go with the basics, the inside out, fear, anger, like joy, grief. It's an added one, but and complex feelings combine a feeling and a thought about it that can code a frame or experience. So when people say I feel guilty, I'll often say that like guilty is an interesting feeling because it's actually not really a feeling. It's like a feeling and then a thought, I shouldn't be feeling this way. And so are you feeling guilty because you're not allowed to relax when you say, I feel guilty that I didn't study last night. So it's not okay for me to feel relaxed and calm. That's not okay for me to feel angry. So it kind of codes like certain words differently and makes us curious about like, what am I actually feeling guilty about? What is it not okay for me to be or feel that like the thought is, or that I'm being chastised for in my head? They very much believe that finding the correct words serves an important function to contain and communicate emotional experiences. And again, since subjectivity is so like pervasive and key, that I do think it is about finding the felt truth experience, that there isn't always the best and exact words for these kinds of things. Problems arise when a look-alike complex event is framed just from a past interpretation. And so if something in the present seems like a similar dynamic, like somebody is like expressed anger in the group and someone takes that to be like, oh, this is like in my household where things got angry and they shut down. That's because they're taking that as like, I did something wrong. I need to like shut down and shouldn't speak anymore because this person's mad at me. And again, like oftentimes happening with that like white flight, right? Behaviors in these intergroup dialogues. So we're wanting to help frame what's the automatic behavior that happened, like, and how does that explain or interpret an event? Like that's what often happens is we kind of have an automatic behavior that's used to explain or interpret something, rather than being able to explore what could be happening and what could be systemically occurring in this. And again, I think when you explore, rather than feeling like you have an exact interpretation or explanation, then you allow a lot of people's subjective experiences to be felt and heard in that. So oftentimes, like SCT tries to discriminate noise, ambiguity, contradiction, redundancy. And when we have noise, there's often like times it'll just trigger us to fall into our past adaptive closed attachment roles. They very much kind of align with attachment theory in some ways, and that we, again, like learned the best ways to adapt to certain roles or responses in people. And so we lock ourselves into those roles and shut down or, you know, kind of push back, whatever that might be, when we feel threatened by that. They frame emotions and feelings differently. So emotions are nonverbal experiences that are communicated spontaneously. A smile, a frown, body language, shrugging, curling your hair, clenching your fists. And so they'll often bring notice to those things and say like, what's the hair twirling mean, Vinny? And I'll be like, I don't know what it means. And they may say like, oh, so your body knows something right now that your mind hasn't figured out yet. That's okay. Like the feeling is like, what's that emotion, that nonverbal kind of experience, if it's translated into words. And so again, like when you say something like, I feel like nobody really gets me, that's a way of like saying, I feel like a thought. And instead of saying, I feel worried that nobody gets me, I feel sad that nobody gets me. Those are the differences, again, that you need to be able to discriminate and reframe quickly. There's also this concept that they talk about where like certain roles that we fall into can hold like a boomerang, which is an idea of like, you know, if we have anger towards someone, then we can retaliatorily like point that anger at ourselves. And oftentimes I would say that that's like the baseline that we all start at, right? Is when we think about authority figures and parents in particular, or even, you know, people with different power differentials in our systems, we can think it's not okay for me to be angry. It's not okay for me as a Black person, as a person of color, to be angry at this institution or to be angry at my professor. There must be something wrong with me. So, right, we've internalized that anger and kind of had this boomerang effect of we throw the anger, but it comes back at us and says like, no, I'm not reinforced to speak my mind. I'm not reinforced to speak out. I'm just told that I'm being disruptive. I'm being like rude, dismissive, aggressive. And that, again, like I take that in personally as like, that's evidence that I have been the problem, which can be really hurtful. So they try and highlight that, like also when those rules can come up. Time travel. So if you're having a scary and past thought, something I like that Yvonne said in her Inpatient book, she says, thoughts that are inside one's head are always more frightening than after you've said them. Would you like to try that out with me right now? And again, it's a nice like open experiment invitation in that Gestalty sense. So that helps test that, that boundary, that this past thought, this past feeling that I'm having. That's when I hold that image in my mind, that becomes my reality, right? That becomes my felt truth experience right now. But if I actually say it in the present moment, there's something like I can test. Like it's, again, with the use of researcher, I think that's kind of in alignment with what they're speaking to here, is like, let's test this experiment by having you speak to what's so fearful and see if your anxiety is lower, higher, the same. And, you know, kind of seeing that happen in the here and now can be very powerful for folks. So when the client is in the psychological boundary across space and time, you know, it's important to notice where they go. And I'd say that's important for all groups too. I like to think of this, again, this is not from SCT specifically, but how I try and comprehend it is, if anxiety is seen as being out of control, and we don't want to be out of control. In fact, we're reinforced our entire life that it's not okay for you to be anxious, to be fearful, to be out of control. You want to feel in control. And so when we think about the future and like what's going to happen when I record this presentation, I want to think about like all the different slides up ahead that I can try and like, you know, control or affect my future outcome. And it's impossible to know what will come into my mind, what will not, like at that moment. But because I'm like stuck in that future, like I'm grasping at air that's a fantasy, that's imagined. And although I feel it as my felt truth, it doesn't actually exist. And so oftentimes clients will talk about things that they fear happening like in a few minutes from now, or even like days or years ahead, that's completely out of their control. But this mindfulness practice, I think, would bring us back to our breath and say, like, all we have is our current felt experience. This is all that is our present experience. The past is muted, it's dead, it's gone, can't change it. And the future is unknowable and unattainable. And so asking yourself and going back to that known present, known self to say, can I predict the future at this time? Do I truly believe that I can see the future? And oftentimes you'd say, no, I don't think I can see the future. So what do I want to do with what I have right now? Because what I have now is not the fantasy that I'm trying to control and hold on to. So paradoxically, by trying to control the future, we make it so that it's impossible to have any control. By being in the present, we can actually control what's happening to us. So that's why we keep going back to the here and now. That's why that's so important in group, instead of people going to storytelling in the past or into the future, which is completely unchangeable. And again, when we are in the future, if we're thinking about that isomorphy from future, present to past, being in the future a feared catastrophe, like I'm afraid that I'm going to be embarrassed and somebody is going to reject me within the group. Well, the only reason that I'd have that future fear is if something in the past has informed me about that, right? Nothing comes from nothing, right? Like it always has to come from something, like whatever our thoughts or emotional felt experience is. And so tracing that thread from like, well, what's the future, thread? There's got to be something in the past that's like my known experience that's informing that. And that's how I'm feeling about it, like presently. That's my felt true experience in this moment. Although both of them are tied to the future and past, I feel it to be true right now. And this becomes really tough, right? Because, if you're thinking about, felt experiences and true experiences, I think it's important to recognize how, well, some of these interventions, we need to be cautious in terms of how we empathize and resonate with the person who's speaking them in the context that they're given, right? Because if we're afraid that people are looking at us differently and, judging us because of our skin color or because of our identity factors, and we frame that as like, would you like to check in on your mind read with others? Then that can be a little like invalidating, right? We don't want to just jump to your mind reading, ask. Nobody here thinks that, because that's not how like the past has informed folks. And again, like most of these biases are unconscious and are not like overtly racist or overtly misogynistic or homophobic or transphobic. But I think in empathizing and being able to say like, again, this feels like a really strongly felt experience, this being othered in this space and not feeling welcome or not feeling like you belong in this, like really, again, trying to attune and resonate with the heart of that message and the depth of the sadness and the profound like loneliness that comes with that, before you start to say something like, I'd really like to like validate, the how meaningful it is for me to hear that. And I wonder, again, knowing that we all hold these things unconsciously, if we want to check in on what's conscious for people right now. It's not to take away that felt experience, but to be curious about like how people are viewing us on their conscious level, recognizing that those systemic strings that pull at them to act differently towards you, they may still be there, but we want to notice those as they happen too. And I hope to invite myself and the group and you to name that as it happens. But let's also be curious if we can. Could I invite you to check in on how people are viewing you now? How would you ask that to the group or to your subgroup or whatever like stage you're in? That again, I think is just trying to work through how do I validate and really continue to own and empathize that true felt experience, and recognizing like how do we connect with people? How do we move forward? I think by acknowledging the unconscious systemic like pull and of the suppressive system, then there's like you can have the both and, right? You can hear the consciousness of where people are currently, and also recognize that they'll have things that pull at them. That doesn't mean that everything is fine and safe forever, but that there's some comfort and maybe even some acknowledgement of their own like experiences of bias or othering that they're feeling in that. So let's see, so reality checking, mentioned that, catastrophe. Yeah, and again, wanting to recognize that explaining these concepts, right, while not invalidating the adaptivity and universality of that common experience. So with that, I think kind of goes the example. The edge of the unknown, again, is a really normal way of just speaking about anxiety and differentiating actually anxiety between anxiety and curiosity. I often say like anxiety and excitement are the same physiological sensations. They're just a different cognitive interpretation. And so you can be wondrous and curious and excited about what could be, or you could be anxious and worried and scared about how you'll be hurt in the future or again. But it's very normal, and they really normalize that apprehensive experience of being uncertain, often feeling dread or anxiety about not knowing what will happen next. So how do we choose that like fork in the road to say, like, I want to be curious about what could be with anticipation and wonder, as opposed to fearful of what my fantasies, are of the catastrophe that's not here. It's a really nice diagram, maps of boundary and space-time, that I think Lewin or Yvonne like adapts from Lewin, again, in terms of like, what's an explaining experience look like? What's an explored experience look like in the past, present, and future self? So for in the past, and we're explaining, we're talking about war stories, we're blaming, we're complaining, we're talking about romances and things. But if we're in the present, or if we're in the exploring past, then we're maybe talking about our emotional intelligence, apprehensive memory. The present experience of explaining is more interpretations based on wishes and fears, whereas the present explored experience is like, what's my present experience? What's reality tests in this moment? Let's do common sense. Again, I think it works at a conscious level. I think it's important, again, to recognize the unconscious ways that things pull at us in the systemic oppressive systems. So I think you can still do this. You just need to be mindful that that is not everything, like, right? Many people do things without recognizing that they're harming others. So in the future, we talk about these negative and positive predictions, mostly negative predictions, I'd say. Anxiety-provoking thoughts, ruminating, pessimism, optimism for the future. I do this all the time. It's really hard not to. Again, like I try to really validate how normal this is, all these experiences are, the mind reading, the future worry. And then the different ways of looking at the future would be that curiosity at the edge of the unknown, formulating hypotheses, and contingency planning. Not so much like that things are going to happen this way, that I need to feel like it's certain in that. But it's how do we direct our energy to work with the group and towards the group, rather than focusing on explaining or going into those fantasy worlds. If we're kind of using different shoulds, ought to, like different ways in which we can say like, oh, there's an expectation of the group that I think is happening, that I'm not allowed to be angry, I'm not allowed to be XYZ. I think, again, that can be helpful when you think of the group as a whole, like the members in the group, or the greater group sociocultural system, where as a woman, you're not allowed to be angry, or else you're seen as bitchy, or you're seen as complaining. And that's something that can still be an expectation, even if no one is saying it overtly in that way. So other social defenses that happen in group: gossiping, thinking out loud, storytelling, joking around. And thinking out loud, I think, is like more musing, like rather than like the think and feel out loud dynamic that are often given as directives in process groups. I'm going to go through these last bits really quickly. The triadic of symptomatic defenses, again, it's just the way that they talk about the defense hierarchies in some ways. There's cognitive distortions, the mind reading the future catastrophe, that divert attention from being able to test things in reality. There's tension generating stress related to old roles, that adaptive roles that we've like locked ourselves into, which seem to avoid emotional experiences. That could be through humor or other kinds of things, like I mentioned before. And there's defending against frustration and the retaliation impulse by constricting it in depression. So again, if I feel angry, I don't want to feel angry, I can't feel angry, it's not okay for me to be angry, so I'm going to be sad and be ashamed and feel like it's my fault that I can't do this group right, or I'm going to act it out by like throwing that anger outwards in an unhelpful or unproductive way. And that's, again, more the fight-flight phases of group development. Now, SCT has like a lot of phases of group development and different hierarchies that they go through specifically. So not to say that I'm going to cover this in a lot of detail, because I'm really not. But one thing that I thought was cool is there's a little distraction exercise that they use to start sessions, which I think is just a unique way that I hadn't really considered doing before. But essentially, when they come in, there's a exercise to say, like, we want to talk about any distractions or news that might keep our energy away from the group. So you just asked your question, do you have any distraction that's keeping your energy out of the group right now? And if the answer is yes to that person, will you give, please separate the facts of your distractions from your feelings about it. So talk to us about the facts, specific, succinct, relevant about what's distracting them. And then like once they've given those like clear, detailed facts of it, then you can ask, now how do you feel about those facts that you've said? So this allows us to kind of discriminate this like, injunction that our feelings are not our facts, which is another kind of distortion in a lot of ways, right? And again, trying to get to this like subjective felt experience, like although it is our felt reality, like that there is like a difference in like what facts can mean and that can mean in a systemic context. But by being able to do that, you can kind of ask at the end, like, will you please leave the facts outside of the group and bring your feelings into the group by making silent eye contact with each member and bring your feeling into your relationship with them. So again, you're kind of saying like, we can't do anything about work being really stressful or your grades or your test coming tomorrow or after this group. So keep those facts out there, but feel your anxiety, feel your anger, feel your shame around it, and connect with like people, look into their eyes and make contact with them to help start to regulate that emotion with others in there. And so I think that's really nice because it does serve to kind of ground people in a tune and resonate with one another, and allows the distracted member to kind of bring up their feelings within the relationship. And if somebody is receiving like something from them, like let's say they talked about their parents just divorcing and how angry with rage they were at that, and then they get angry at somebody else in group, they can recognize this person has a divorce with his parents that are just happened to him, and so now I don't have to. It maybe gives me another layer to not personalize that as all on me, their anger that they're expressing right now. So I think that's really cool, and something that I'd be willing to like try out in different groups to see how that helps maybe contain some things, though I don't do real traditional check-ins in that way. But there's a hierarchy of defenses against authority, and keeping people connected to the here and now and their consciousness, present selves is the primary first goal. There's usually going to be a flight where people want to like use their social defenses, their storytelling, their choking, their cognitive distortions, that they're anxious, future catastrophe, and then their tension, and this tension of like avoidance of arousal and emotion. So she kind of frames this as like, if you feel like in that dorsal vagal kind of polyvagal theory, to say like, oh, I'm not really feeling anything right now. And she'd be like, oh, okay, so you're tensing, you're clenching like right now. And so, oftentimes this may not be what's happening now, but like sometimes we tense when we're feeling really a strong emotion that we don't want to open ourselves up to. And I wonder if that might be happening for you right now. Like, you think that could be taking place? And that's like yeah, it could be. Like I could be feeling something, but like I'm fine. Like, so that I think gives some more opportunity for us to start to be curious about like what different behavioral or emotional markers for that indifference or tension might be. And then between fight and flight, there's also that retaliatory impulse, again, that my anger comes inward towards us. And then there's this subphase of fighting, which can be people getting into their role lock defenses, projections, projective identification, into one up, one down role relationships, that somebody's the higher person, someone's the lower one in the relationship. The identification of the scapegoating, the victiming, bullying. It's not that SAT is like immune to these things happening. It's just less likely to happen in these dynamics. She gives a story, Yvonne, about a large group that fell into the scapegoating dynamic, and it was around not personalizing things, ironically. So people got very angry and scapegoaty at the people personalizing things, which meant that personalizing was kind of being personalized in some ways. But the helpful thing, again, it's as we're continuing down these phases, that all these are normative, and there's also going to be some shift between like authority and intimacy, and so they may lash back out at the leader, the group leader, that authority figure, as well as be resistant to being intimate with one another, and have resistances to their defenses, externalize conflicts with the authority, disown them, etc. Phase 2, hierarchy of defenses against intimacy. There's this defense against separating, individuating from people, and then subphases of enhancement and hope. Again, like others, for disenchantment and despair. So very small in the details here. I think, again, this is something I hope just piques your interest, so that if you're really into SCT, or this feels like it really resonates with you, that you go to the training institutions, which are very thorough and probably give you much more depth to these specific phases. And then the third phase that they speak about is defenses against interdependent work, defenses against knowing, inner reality, outer reality. And again, these things may take time to form. So the downside is, like, when you look at SCT demo groups at AGPA or in other formats, you don't really get to see the later stages. Most of the time it's fight and flight, just because the group hasn't had time to develop, and that's understandable. But I think that's part of what I think might be meaningful if you do a dedicated training within this kind of experience. Lastly is the way that they end their sessions. And again, it's just a nice little prompt to say, like, do you have any surprises, learnings, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, discoveries? I feel like you need to write these out because it's always confusing to, like, jump in them. But I like it because, again, it speaks to different experiences that somebody can have within the group, and helps differentiate and also invite the dissatisfaction and frustrations that could be occurring within that space. So I think that is it for this. Yep. So thank you again for your time going through this lovely theory, and I hope it was helpful to be able to pique your interest into a unique modality.